Hello and welcome to Please Expand. I'm Helios Rockney, and today I have with me Fernando Cervantes, who is at the University of Bristol and the author of Conquistadores. In the book, it doesn't say a new history, but people call it Conquistadores a new history. Is that the official title?
Yes, I think it does say that in the title, doesn't it?
No, not on the title page actually.
In the subtitle
No,
on
not even there.
the cover. Oh, right. I thought, well, the paperback edition definitely has the a new history. That wasn't something that I added. It was the publishers who added that. I
Right.
think it's at the moment it's a fad. I've seen so many new histories, but at least it wasn't. The Americans wanted to call it the untold history. And I thought, no,
It's dramatic.
that's just stupid. It's been told so many times. So they also called it a new history of Spanish discovery and conquest. I think the
Right, okay.
longer subtitle.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So before we get into the book itself, perhaps you could say a bit about why you thought that this book needed to be written.
yeah. It wasn't my idea actually. I was working on more recondite topics as one does in universities, and one day I was just rung up by um, an agent called Felicity Bryan, who told me that she'd just come back from New York and that Viking were very keen to have a book on the conquistadors because the big anniversaries were coming up. The first mainland landings really happened in about 1519 in Mexico, and then the conquest of Mexico in 1521. So those were big landmarks that needed some kind of volume. And I said to her that it wasn't really my turf, in the sense that it's not the kind of book that I would have thought about writing myself. But she was very insistent. She very quickly convinced me that it could be done, and that there wasn't anything recent, and certainly no single volume that deals with all the conquests. There are good volumes dealing with the history of Peru, the famous John Hemming, the conquest of the Incas. Of course, there's Hugh Thomas, who in the early 90s wrote a very good history of the conquest of Mexico. They're both quite traditional in the sense that they're big narrative histories, and that's what they wanted. But what the kind of the originality that I thought I could bring into it is just incorporate quite a lot of the recent research. The way in which the whole of the early modern Spain and the way in which they incorporated all these regions of the Americas has been rethought. The traditional history is one based on the model of extraction. That they got there and they exploited colonies for the sake of the metropolis, and that really doesn't really work at all for the 16th and 17th centuries. It worked a little bit for the 18th century because that's when the Bourbon reforms, trying to catch up, the Spaniards realizing that they were lagging behind the big empires of Britain, France, and Holland in particular, wanted to emulate them, and they really did turn the Spanish American kingdoms into colonies for extraction purposes. So in the years leading up to the independence, you have a lot of that, bad government sensation throughout the Americas that then they incorporated into the nationalist histories in the 19th century. And since then, it's very, very difficult to get away from that image, that you have 300 years of horrendous obscurantist exploitation by these savages that were the Spaniards, and how dare anyone try to understand them? They just need to be condemned. I mean, that really is the woke approach right now. In the States, it was rubbished in the New York Times, for attempting to do the impossible. But I think it will kind of gradually establish a new approach to this that I think is very, very important. The need to contextualize rather than just condemn, which is not very interesting, is it? I mean,
No.
history is full of enigmas that we need to try to understand, and this is one of them.
Well, that was precisely what I found so fascinating in your book. It's very subtle, I think, actually, because it's not the take-home message that I got, at least, was not that the Spanish weren't brutal or that they weren't self-interested, but what your account does, and I think I'm quoting a reviewer of one of your books now, it takes some of the wickedness out of it. It makes the brutality seem less mindless, almost less cruel, and it puts, as you say, into this context, this well, as you say, this late medieval Christian crusading culture, which in many respects is a new history because I never thought of this context as being the mindset of a Columbus, a Cortes, a Pizarro. Could you say a bit about this culture that you want to frame the conquistadors in, and the role it plays in your reframing?
Mm-hmm. Well, basically, it's trying to get away from the tendency that we have to see the discovery of America as marking a big change in the mentality of Europeans. Once America is there, you have a big area that you can exploit in order to enrich Europe. You have the beginning of the capitalist system, and it leads straight to the modern world. And that's something that economic historians stressed, especially in the 1960s and 70s. That really was the model. The discovery of America really is the beginning of the modern world. What I wanted to emphasize is more along the lines of what John Eliot did in that little book back in it was some lectures he gave in Belfast in 1969. They were published as The Old World and the New. And the big question that he asked there is this very intriguing question of why it took so long for Europeans to realize the novelty of America. It took a very long time. Mm-hmm. If you see, Columbus died in 1506, convinced that he'd reached some part of Asia. Most Europeans couldn't really incorporate the novelty of America. Even after the conquest of Mexico, which was obviously something completely new, something that hadn't been there in classical or scriptural sources. And yet you see Cortes still in the late 20s, when he goes back to Europe to get his interview with Charles V and get another so-called capitulación, the authorization to explore further. And he still thinks that China is just up the road. That's what he's going to do. He's going to get to China. He's going to get to the Spice Islands. There's still very much this mentality that there are Christians in Asia that are going to be very, very willing to help the Spaniards, the Western Christians, to conquer Jerusalem. That was still very much the idea that it was the conquest of Jerusalem that was the driving force behind the early explorations. We tend to think in terms of avarice and the quest for gold and all that sort of thing. But if you put gold in its symbolic context, it's not really the kind of greed that the modern capitalist system enthrones. It's a very different kind of thing because it gives you the power to spread the faith. Of course, you can't separate personal enrichment, and that everybody was very keen to be rich, but it was the kind of richness that would allow you to become a big Renaissance mecenas. To give more, to give things away. It was not capital accumulation that was the driving force. So it's a very different mentality, and you can see it. I think the one of the key chapters of the book is when I get into the mendicant friars that were encouraged and given every facility by the conquistadors to spread the Christian message, and it's a very, very late medieval type of evangelization. It's not the kind of thing that we're used to nowadays. Again, we tend to think of the spread of Christianity as something which is politically incorrect, because it's Western. It goes hand in hand with power. This idea that the sword and the cross went together. That's very much a later understanding of evangelization, very post-Reformation, in the sense that after the Reformation, you have this very, very strong opposition between different faiths, and they start stressing differences. I am Catholic because I'm not Protestant, and therefore I'm going to emphasize all the Catholic things that are particularly anti-Protestant, and vice versa. So you get this hardening of confessional positions that requires much more of an intellectual assent. So conversion is much more an intellectual event. You have to convince these people; they have to accept it, and if they don't accept it, then you can use violence, because obviously they are in the wrong and you're in the right. I don't see very much of that kind of attitude in the early centuries of evangelization. It's very much a pre-Reformation experiment. These friars were convinced that the indigenous peoples of America had in the past been exposed to some kind of Christian influence. They were still very much in the framework of the expansion of Christianity in the early years. Christ had told the apostles to preach the gospel to the ends of the world. Therefore, it must have happened. There was this idea, just like Thomas was believed to have evangelized India. Maybe they said, well, maybe he carried on and reached America, because they were still thinking that it was very close. That America was very, very close to India. I mean, the fact that they are called Indians is a dead giveaway, isn't it? So it's still very much in that mentality. These people have been evangelized in the past. They've forgotten it. So we're here just to remind them about the truth, and they will accept it very naturally. And what you see is a fascinating process of adaptation between the two cultures that is incredibly gradual. There's no violent imposition of Christianity on the indigenous cultures, because these friars were very, very clever at incorporating anything that would allow for the spread of Christianity. So they used the native languages, they used dances, rituals, they used the same places of worship. They kept quoting that famous letter of Pope Gregory the Great in the 6th century. In the 6th century, late 6th century, he wrote to Bishop Mellitus, advising him to remind Augustine of Canterbury, who had been sent to England to re-Christianize England. Because England was nominally Christian because of the conversion of Constantine, but in fact, Gregory realized that there was still quite a lot of paganism, and that Augustine needed to re-Christianize England. But this letter says, please don't make the mistake of annoying these people. Do not destroy temples. Allow them to go back to the same places, because that will be a much more sensible approach. And these mendicant friars constantly quote that letter, and they stress that the situation in Mexico is exactly the same as the situation in England under Gregory and in Germany under Boniface. So that's really the parallel. You have to think in terms of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. And that's the kind of religion that spreads in Spanish America in the 16th and 17th centuries. And the fascinating thing is that it's just how resilient it is. How these friars established the foundations of an unofficial tradition that remains to this day. You can see it. Anyone traveling in Spanish America can see that these are genuinely Christian cultures, which are also genuinely local, autochthonous. With lots of native incorporations. That Western anthropologists usually think that it's some kind of halfway house that is not proper. They didn't finish the job. But if you think about it, how can you finish the job? I mean, what is there such a thing? Would you be able to understand proper Christianity? I don't think it's possible. We have an understanding of Christianity that is very modern. It's post-Reformation, and we think that's what should have been implemented. And when we see evidence that it wasn't, we're very critical. But in fact, you really need to get inside the mentality of the time and try to understand the context. And that, I think, is a much more fruitful approach to take than one which emphasizes dichotomies.
In fact, as I was reading that chapter, it made me think of Keith Thomas's book, Religion and the Decline of Magic.
Uh-huh.
And in the early chapters of that book, he really stresses the pagan influences on English Christianity, at least, and the preservation of shrines, of what were they called? Wells, healing wells. That's the one,
Yeah.
healing wells, and the saint days. I saw the force of your point that it is indeed the case that the spread of Christianity, at least in England, from my knowledge, took on this image of incorporating local symbology. I suppose the doubt, if you want, in the modern mind, right, is this sort of this purist approach that the religion of the Native Americans was sort of this pure thing that has been tainted by a Christian influence. But in your book, you also stress, in fact, the polytheism of these religions, how they incorporate lots of gods from people they've conquered or people they've been conquered by. And in fact, the biggest problems they had was that they thought that they were giving them Christianity and they thought they were adopting it the way they thought about Christianity, but in fact, they were just putting it together with their whole wealth of gods, and they had the devil and they had God all together. And this just seemed horribly heretical to some of the friars, but yeah, it was their way of incorporating it.
Mm-hmm. But also,
Yeah.
I mean, there are some friars that really understand what's going on. You know, like Duran in particular, this Dominican, a very, very clever Dominican who wrote that, you know, how can you expect a complete assimilation of what we're trying to do so soon? He's writing in the 1550s. And he says, you know, they are on the way. And they are explaining it to me that, you know, that famous term that he uses, which is borrowed from the Nahuatl, you know, the lingua franca of central Mexico, which is Nepantla. But this Indian says, you know, you should not be worried that we're still Nepantla. And Duran says, and I asked him what he meant by this term. And he says, oh, well, that they're neither fully Christian nor fully pagan, but on the way. And that I need to understand that their gods fed them in the past. So there's no reason why they shouldn't be feeding them in the present. That, you know, you have to make allowances for this. And also you need to understand just how difficult the situation was, because as soon as the friars began to stress the point that these ancient deities, pre-Hispanic deities, needed to be displaced because the Christian God was the only God, you get the spread of smallpox. You know, one of the biggest tragedies in human history. I mean, COVID we wouldn't have noticed it on the graphs. You know, the amount of mortality that you get with the spread of smallpox in Spanish America is tragic, really, truly tragic. Imagine these Indians thinking, well, it's when we displace the gods that we're being punished. So obviously the gods are angry with us. These friars tell us that these gods are devils. Well, we've got to make sacrifices to the devil. And they very candidly say, yes, we went up to the mountain to sacrifice to the devil because we need him to come to our help. And the friars were saying, but how can you possibly think that the devil is going to come to your help? Well, because look what's happening. You know, so these kinds of conversations were going on in the middle of the 16th century all the time. The friars were very, very quick to understand that it was not something to worry about unduly. You know, that they needed to understand what they were doing. And very often they said, well, if we just give them different parameters, they will very, very gradually incorporate these rites into a Christian culture. So that's when you get the way in which they use the saints and the angels, you know, which were not that was a perfectly orthodox late medieval type of devotion. Saints and angels, they were not worshipped; they were venerated. So that's what they needed to begin to stress, so that the Indians would eventually develop a culture that could be recognized in any part of Western Europe at that time. Well, Catholic Western Europe, because obviously after the Reformation you get a very strong displacement of saints and angels from the Protestant tradition, saints in particular, because they couldn't really do away with angels and demons because they were scriptural. A good Protestant would not be able to say that angels were not important. But the kind of relationship that you have with this very overpopulated supernatural world that you have in the late medieval period was translated to Spanish America and took root. It is a very rich supernatural world.
And that was very evocative of Keith Thomas's work, actually. You also briefly mentioned this, and in your book you talk about it a lot. There is this tension between the friars on the ground, as it were, in in America, and the religious authorities in mainland Spain. And it's a tension between, people who sort of get the idea, they see what's going on, and they understand what they need to do to succeed. And you've got people who have this much more abstract notion of what's going on. And you introduce this term, obedezco pero no cumplo. I obey but do not implement. And this is a pretty important term in your book. It's you show its importance throughout. And much like when we started, the quest for gold and the spread of the Christian faith strikes us as hypocritical, as something that cannot possibly be contained within the mind of someone who is genuine. This expression also strikes us as rather incoherent. Could you say a bit about how it was used, why it was used, and again how it changes how we think about these events?
Well, I think a good place to start is just to see how candid the acceptance that they had gone to the New World. They all said to serve God, the King, and to get rich. It's quite disarming, isn't it? The frankness of the statement. You can't
Yes,
say that they're
it
not
is.
being honest about it. And there's no real contradiction. There isn't the tension that we see now. We tend to think of the very stark saying in the gospel, you cannot serve God and mammon. But I think these conquistadors and the early friars would have seen mammon as the complete attachment to material wealth, so that it blinds you to anything else. But they were very keen to explain that the good use of wealth, and gold had mystical qualities. It wasn't like the kind of ready cash that we have in banks now. Well, it's not even ready cash now. It's in cryptocurrencies and all this kind of thing. It wasn't like that at all. It was something very solid and created by God in a kind of a hierarchy of goods. So that's something that we need to remember. It's not it doesn't have the associations with mammon that we tend to think in the capitalist system. It's something much more benevolent and something that can actually lead to a lot of good. You can do a lot of good with this gold. I'm not saying that it happened. That a lot of the time it was there was serious abuse and serious exploitation and everything else. I mean, humans are humans. Okay, but what I'm trying to emphasize is the context where you can understand why these arguments could be voiced without any fear of contradiction. And that's the mentality that we need to try to understand in order not to be unfair to these people. So the principle of obedezco pero no cumplo, I think, is fascinating because it comes from a very, very long tradition, medieval tradition of separate kingdoms. Because Spain was a mosaic of kingdoms that very gradually united until with the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabel, you have for the first time what you might call a united Spain in a very anachronistic sense of the word, because it's not a modern nation state, but you have the beginnings of what we understand nowadays as Spain, with the exception of Portugal, okay? Because the attempt was to unify Portugal as well, and Hispania, in the Roman sense of the word, included Portugal. So we have a bit of a complication there. But you have all these processes of unification go hand in hand with a very, very strong realization that the important thing for the monarchs to do is to protect the rights and the privileges of the autonomous kingdoms. that they form. They don't want to trespass on those rights and privileges, what in Spanish is called fueros, which is quite a difficult word to translate because it also incorporates historic rights. It's something that has grown out of the particular circumstances of that particular kingdom, and it's unique to that particular kingdom. The role of the monarch is to protect those fueros, those rights. The monarch is the fountainhead of justice. You can appeal directly to the monarch if those rights are being trampled by either invaders or people who are not respecting them. The growing, certainly the frontier aristocrats who very often trampled on the rights of the towns. You have the growth of the mercantile classes, and because a lot of them were from outside Spain, the whole of southern Spain was saturated with Genoese. So you have these tensions growing, and the role of the monarch is to protect those rights and privileges. That's where the principle of obedezco pero no cumplo comes into play. And it was deployed incredibly cleverly by all the conquistadors. I mean, Cortes is a genius with it. I mean, he really, the way in which he, all his letters to Charles V emphasize that what he's doing is serving God and the monarch against the avarice of people like Velázquez, who were only after their own interests. Obviously there's quite a lot of rhetoric, and but that's the point he's trying to make, and that's why his letters are so convincing, and that's how he managed to win over the support of groups of Spaniards that were sent to bring him under control. He very quickly just managed to turn the tables on them and say, look, now you're in the same situation. If you leave, you're going to go against the interests of the king. You don't want to do that. You better side with me. And very quickly, he began to do the same thing to indigenous communities. They said, it's in your interest to side with me against the oppressors. Because he very soon realized that the Mexica, as what we know as the Aztecs nowadays, were not very popular. And he could very quickly took advantage of that. And the number of alliances that he formed with indigenous peoples immediately brings to light that the indigenous groups in Mexico and in Peru, when you eventually arrive in Peru, were very, very quick to identify with the Spaniards much more readily than with indigenous groups that were against them. So there is no indigenous identity. That's something that is very, very important to emphasize. We tend to think that, the indigenous peoples had some kind of identity, and that was violated by the arrival of the Europeans. But in fact, the heterogeneity of these cultures is enormous. And they themselves could see enormous differences between them, and many more similarities with what the Spaniards were trying to do. So that's what explains the alliances. And another thing that comes to light when you think about these issues is that the modern concept of race can also be very misleading, because they didn't have race as we understand it nowadays, which is something genetic and inherited. Race was much more something, an adaptation to the environment. Just think about Columbus worried about going brown and losing his beard if he carried on eating rodents in Jamaica. There is a letter saying, we're going to end up looking like these people, and that would happen within their lifetime. It was what you ate and where you lived that made you look like that, and it would happen. So race was not a concept as we understand it nowadays. That's another very important thing to bear in mind.
And just on this this topic, the relationship between the conquistadors or the Spaniards and the indigenous people, there is also a great nuance in how they view them. Yes, there are times when they view them as backwards and savage, but there are other times when they look at where they are and they are in awe that these places could exist. Tenochtitlan is the obvious example, but Cusco as well. And there's this wonderful letter. Can't remember who writes. Is it Cortes to Charles V, talking about how beautiful
yes.
Tenochtitlan is, or maybe
Bernal Diaz is also very. He can't stop praising the beauty of Tenochtitlan, and obviously they're writing with hindsight, and many years later, and obviously there are exaggerations, because the descriptions have lots of parallels with European architecture that we know didn't exist in Spanish America. So in their imagination, they incorporated all sorts of things, to make it look like some kind of Renaissance city, and extremely luxurious city. It had great advances, and if you think of the density of population of Tenochtitlan, 200,000 people, I think only Constantinople came close in those days, or should I say Istanbul, because the Ottoman conquest has already happened. But all the Spaniards already carried on referring to Constantinople, so that was the and they were still hopeful that they would be able to recover it from the Ottomans. They were still, fighting the Ottomans. So that's you are rooted in that tradition and that mentality, and it's being fed constantly by popular literature as well. Because you've got to remember that most of these people were very keen readers of romances of chivalry, and some of these romances of chivalry, it was quite difficult to draw the line between myth and fact. Some of these romances that came back, that arrived in the 1510s and 20s, had already incorporated some of the stuff that these writers in Europe were reading about the New World. And then they came back, talking about Calafia and the Amazons and whatever. So the Spaniards knew that, there were fountains of rejuvenating waters just up the road, and that they would be able to find cities paved in gold and women whose bodies never aged. And all this kind of stuff was really in their minds, very realistic. It wasn't just an escape of the imagination. It was something that was really feeding their outlook and what they wanted to do.
obviously whenever anyone talks about this subject, we talk about Bartolomeo de las Casas' very important account. What are we to do with this first-hand account in light of the points that you want to make? How do they relate to each other? Because his account, it's devastating. It's an endless tale of brutality.
Yeah. Las Casas has at least two very different styles. If you read his very academic works, the history of the Indies and the Apologetica Historia Sumaria, which he wrote in the 1550s and 60s, trying to establish and to convince his contemporaries really that the Aztecs and the Incas and the Mayas were comparable and in some senses superior to the Greeks and the Romans. So if Greek and Roman mythology and thought and traditions, especially the traditions of the virtues and the whole ethical system, had been so readily incorporated into Christianity, there was no reason why that the same thing shouldn't happen in the New World. So it's a very, very interesting exercise in what you might call, a first attempt at comparative ethnology, as Anthony Pagnon once called it, in that seminal book that he wrote in the 80s, The Fall of Natural Man, where he actually gets into Las Casas and Acosta are the two big thinkers in that book, and he really explains where they were coming from and what they were trying to do academically, both of them, and it's very, very interesting stuff. Then you have the Las Casas, who is desperate to scandalize the court in Spain in order to implement reform. That's what he wants. He wants to abolish the system of encomienda. The encomiendas were these grants of land with Indians to Europeans. And it was inspired, obviously, in the feudal idea that you would provide protection in return for, some kind of military service, and you would make sure that, and labor, and you would make sure that they were well looked after and Christianized and all that sort of thing. And Las Casas saw that, that it was very rare for the Spaniards who had Indians in encomienda to treat them as they should. They were not interested in their Christianization. Many of them, in fact, were arguing that you would first exploit them and then Christianize them, because if you Christianize them, then by definition you wouldn't be able to exploit them, because they would be free. Many of these, a spurious argument was that if you capture them in war, then you could legitimately enslave them. That was something that Spanish legislation from the very, very beginning, in the 1490s and 1503, 1504, Isabel in particular, just before her death, is adamant that this is not, that this just cannot happen. She returns the enslaved Indians that Columbus had sent, because they were captured in war. And there was also the allegations of cannibalism and human sacrifice and whatever. And she said, look, I don't care. They are my subjects and therefore free. So that was a very, very important distinction. It was not that some people think that Isabel didn't believe in slavery. That's nonsense. Of course, everybody at the time believed in slavery. We're not at the time of emancipation. Slavery was an accepted fact of life. But you could not enslave your subjects. That was the principle. So once the Spaniards were in America, these indigenous peoples, if they accepted the sovereignty of the Spanish monarchs, they were subjects and therefore free. And Las Casas, that's the point that Las Casas was making all the time. And because it wasn't happening, and because of all the abuses that he witnessed, he wanted the court to implement reform. And that's when he writes the brief account of the destruction of the Indies, which is a diatribe, in the style of the time. That's what you did in those days. Everybody did that sort of thing. Everybody. It's not that he's a liar. He's a rhetorician, and he's using everything in his power to scandalize the court in order to implement reform. So that's how you need to see it. What happened, of course, is that all these writings, the brief account of the destruction in particular, but others as well, and others it was not just Las Casas who was writing to the Spanish court, emphasizing the abuses and all that sort of thing. All that material could be used by the detractors of Spain, especially in Holland and England in the late 16th, early 17th centuries, which it was in their interest to paint as dark a picture of Spain as possible, because Spain was the greatest power and the greatest enemy of the other budding European power. So it was really grist to their mill. You can see, especially William of Orange in his apology, his famous apology, which is another diatribe against especially Philip II, but everything Spanish. And he uses Las Casas with, of course, all the illustrations of Theodore the Brie, those chilling illustrations of human sacrifice and cannibalism, but also of Spanish oppression, how the Spaniards just burnt the Indians by their hundreds and all that sort of thing. All that was amalgamated into the 19th century historiography, of nationalist historiography, especially of the Inquisition as well. The Inquisition as an engine of tyranny and the most horrendous judicial institution in history. A lot of people still think that, but in the last 30, 40 years, the revisionist historiography of the Inquisition has painted a totally different picture. So all that is very, very slowly sinking in, and we need to make use of it in order to paint a more balanced picture of what happened. I mean, the Inquisition is fascinating because when you ask yourself why there wasn't a witch craze in Spain, it's the only Western European country where no witches were burnt, and it's because of the Inquisition. Not many people accept that. They say, how can this possibly be? There were no intellectuals burnt in Spain. Occasionally there were a few imprisoned in order to be questioned, but none of them were burnt. So when you compare that kind of thing to what was going on in the rest of Europe, you can actually see the Inquisition as a force for moderation in many respects. And some of the innovations in the treatment of prisoners, the famous secrecy that everybody thinks, oh, how could it possibly? You got your prisoners and you didn't allow them to communicate, and everything that they said was secret. It sounds awful, doesn't it? But it was very deliberately done so that they would get so that the inquisitors would get proper testimonies, because in the early years, what they found was that they were getting exactly the same thing from different quarters, and they thought, oh, this is very strange. If we had some variation, then it would be more believable. But to get exactly the same thing, it means that these people have been communicating with each other. So we've got to keep them apart. So, you can understand why this was happening. And it's a very slow process of progress in the judicial system that actually leads to more enlightened ways of dealing with injustice. But that, you mentioned that to students in the first year, and they think that you've gone mad. How can you possibly try to defend such an outrageous institution? Not trying to defend it. I certainly don't want it back. But let's try to see how they operated. Once you do that, it's quite easy to get inside the mentality of the people who went out there. I mean, they came out of this world, and it was not peculiarly Spanish. This was the rule throughout Europe at the time. So this idea that it was the Spanish in particular that were the barbarians and the savages and the obscurantists, and that is a much later prejudice.
Okay, yeah, and you in your chapter on the friars, you spend a lot of time teasing out those details and drawing important distinctions between how people treated the native religions. So your book concludes with a very interesting musing on our perception of the legitimacy of these kingdoms, and they appear to lack legitimacy. They almost look feudal to our eyes because they're not sort of sovereign states, right? And you say that to our modern sensibilities, it is only in the modern state that a people can truly express themselves through, I suppose, political mechanisms. And you challenge this notion, and you suggest that not only did these kingdoms give adequate expression to the people who inhabited them, but that they might even be better than the sovereign states that eventually became. And so, firstly, I found this a difficult concept to grasp. So, could you please break it down a bit and explain why we should view these kingdoms with a more, firstly, how they're different to sort of a sovereign state, and why they might be more positive or more balanced?
Well,
maybe
the world of the 16th and 17th centuries is very much a world of the composite state, or the composite monarchy, where you have different things integrated into a system, with the fueros that I call the local privileges respected, and that very famous annotation by Philip II to a permission for a Venetian to travel from Lisbon to Barcelona. Do you remember? Permission is given for this Venetian ambassador to travel from Lisbon to Barcelona, and Philip writes, no, it must say from Lisbon to the frontiers of the Kingdom of Portugal and Castile, and from there to the frontiers of the Kingdom of Castile and Aragon, and from there to Barcelona. It's very important that it's done that. So he's making a point, and this is just one in a huge number of examples of the way in which he was so jealous of protecting the autonomy of these different kingdoms. That doesn't really. That's always in the historiography has been seen as some kind of in-between stage in the development of the modern unitary nation state. That was almost like a natural development. What I want to question is it necessarily so? Because at the moment we're seeing the disintegration of the unitary nation state. We have seen how some exaggerations of nationalism can lead to horrendous abuses. So, in other words, that the unitary nation state is not necessarily the end point of political progress. So what I was trying to say, I mean, you say that in some ways better than. I, if I said that, I think it might have been a bit exaggerated, but I don't remember actually saying. What I was trying to say is that there are lots of things there that we can learn from. Yeah, they're not necessarily better, but they do give a different approach. And if you're interested in transnational forms of political organization, which I think a lot of people in the modern world are very interested in. When I was writing this book, it was right in the middle of the Brexit debates. The Brexiteers are firm believers in the unitary sovereign state. Those against Brexit realize that transnational forms of organization are going to stay and probably grow in importance. So learning from pre-nationalist forms of organization is important. And there the principle of obedezco pero no cumplo is right in the middle of it. This understanding of obedience, because that's another thing. Our modern understanding of ethics is very, very post-Cartesian and basically Kantian, in the sense that that obedience really is bowing down to authority, regardless of what's being ordered. If a person in authority tells you to do something, you got to obey, whether you agree with it or not. I say this understanding would have made no sense back in the 16th century, because obedience came from the Latin ob audire, which was to listen, to establish a conversation in order to arrive at a consensus. And to obey a stupid order doesn't make sense. If you can prove that this is not going to work, then you are within your rights to object to it and not to implement. I think that's a very healthy attitude. Of course, a lot of people say, well, no, it just proves, it is evidence that the Spanish system was terribly corrupt. Of course, I'm not denying that the principle of obedezco pero no cumplo was used a lot of the time for corrupt, self-interested reasons, but that doesn't do away with the intellectual integrity of the principle. And many times it was used in very in a good way, in ways that actually liberated people from oppression. So there are all sorts of things like that I think if we contextualize these attitudes that are so difficult to understand from a modern perspective and try to get inside the mentality, they can open up all sorts of questions in our current situation to allow us to see ways of dealing with things that could be much more constructive, and certainly not leading to the kind of polarizations that we're seeing right now. There's too much polarization and a very, very inadequate degree of communication. We need to try to open up the minds of people a bit more, and seeing something so different and try to understand it. If you see this is very, very different, but if you try to understand it, you come back to the modern world and you can see things in a different light.
Yeah, so is, in a very simplistic way, is sort of the take-home message of your book that these people were functioning within a coherent system of thought, a coherent culture, and we shouldn't view them as just crazed, brutal individuals.
Yeah. I would certainly say that they were as human and as fallible as we are now. And,
right. Yeah.
And the emphasis is really on type of culture that was intrinsically religious, because that's another thing that we find very difficult to understand. We tend to separate religion from culture in a way, because religion is much more nowadays something for the individual conscience. It's something that is your business, and what you believe shouldn't really affect, and you certainly shouldn't try to impose it on other people. That's how it's a very individualist and a very interiorized form of religion, and it separates really mind and matter. That's why I say it's post-Cartesian in that sense. And that, again, you have to constantly remind yourself that in the 16th and 17th centuries in the Hispanic world, religion just permeated everything. You couldn't separate. It would have made no sense to conduct your life without reference to the divine powers. It would have been as absurd to do that as it would have been to cultivate the soil without reference to the course of the seasons. It was a very integrated liturgical culture, and that's another aspect that needs quite a lot of imagination in order to get inside that kind of mentality.
Yeah, I think we perhaps also struggle to believe that people could have been genuinely motivated by religious motives, and we tend to think we have a much more materialistic notion of motivations nowadays.
Yeah, that any kind of religious motive is obviously an excuse for personal gain.
Yeah,
and that I'm not denying that there was quite a lot of selfish motives have always been there.
yeah,
But in the system, it made perfect sense. You wouldn't have been able to justify your actions without reference to the religious culture that was all around, and it was much more ritualistic, much more liturgical in the sense of being public, public worship. All these processions, the whole of political life was imbued with religious symbolism. I suppose in England you can see it. There's quite a lot of that in the political culture of Parliament. Because it's rooted in medieval rituals, but it's not something that people understand. I mean, they see it as trappings of something to attract the tourists, really.
yeah. It's lost its symbolic value.
Yeah. But there is quite a lot of symbolic value there. The fact that the Queen is the head of the church and that she's crowned by the Archbishop. There's a symbiosis there between religion and culture that the modern world really doesn't understand. It tends to separate the two. But we need to constantly try to remind ourselves that was not the case in the 16th century, and it takes a lot of imaginative effort because we adopt the default position. It's very easy just to say, here's they were just out to enrich themselves and to exploit the Indians, and it was all horrible and whatever. But just see what it produced. The cultural richness of Spanish America is there. I mean, I know that in the 19th and 20th centuries it led the expansion of liberalism and the liberal reforms and the abolition of all the laws of the Indies that the Spanish monarchy had implemented, led to much more marginalization of indigenous societies, and it led to quite a lot of failed progress that you can see everywhere. But if you go to the regions and see what survives of the so-called colonial period, I don't like calling it colonial. I think I prefer to call it viceregal. That kind of that religious culture that emerged in Spanish America in the 16th and 17th century is very resilient. And it's still there. You can see it everywhere. It's a tribute to that religious culture. We need to. There's no reason why we shouldn't reevaluate it, and it teaches us all sorts of things.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it was fascinating to read about all these things. Just final question. That's how I like to conclude the podcast. I just like to ask my guests what they're working on right now. What should we expect from Fernando Cervantes?
Well, I'm trying to get back into projects that I was working on before I was so oddly distracted by in order to write this book. And I was actually writing on angels and demons,
Right.
trying to understand the theology behind them and from a religious cultural perspective. So yeah, in about 2 or 3 years, I think I'll finish a book on angels and demons in the Hispanic world, and then after that, I've been asked to write the Oxford History of Early Modern Europe, the volume on Spain and the Hispanic world. So that's obviously going to take me quite a while because that's quite a big volume.
Yeah, but there's a interesting line of connection with your book just now.
Yes, I think so. Yeah. Yeah. I mean the angels and demons things is very. It's a very good way into that culture because at the moment I'm reading quite a lot on Byzantine history, because that's where the inspiration came from. What is a liturgical culture? How do these supernatural entities relate to human beings? Why are they there? Why are they important? And what's their function in the coherence, not just of the political organizations, but of all the cultural expressions? Because, again, we tend to see these things as remnants of a system that is now superseded. Nobody believes in angels anymore, or demons, because Newton, the laws of gravity, he proved that you didn't need angels to push planets around, that it all happened through magnetism and all this kind of thing. But then you read the latest works by Newton. Was very, very interested in angels, so that
Yeah, deeply religious.
why take this lineal approach? That there is a progress from magic to religion to science. Well, they're asking very different questions, and we have to remind ourselves that we have to approach the world in a more in a way that allows us to ask deeper questions, and to puzzle ourselves. Because human beings are very puzzling creatures. You never know why they are acting in a particular way. There are always all sorts of complications behind them.
That's great. Okay, well, thank you once again for coming on the podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Enjoyed it a lot. Thanks very much.